Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Upward Mobility Framework Overview Workshop. My name is Jesus Guzman, and I'm a Policy Program Associate in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. Today, myself and my colleagues, Alexis Weaver and Isabella Solosi, are going to be presenting on the Upward Mobility Framework as a foundation for understanding for sustained upward mobility from poverty. So a quick note on this training, we are presenting the same content we covered during the April 4th webinar with the same title. So if you attended that session, a lot of these materials will be familiar to you. So please don't feel obligated to stay on, though the question and answer sections may be slightly different. If you are looking for the next topical training on this, that will be held on July 9th when we dive deeper into the mobility metrics. And we encourage you to register and attend that session if you haven't yet. We'll also be offering a new local action workshop on July 30th. The links to register for both of those have been provided in the chat. So for today's agenda, first, I'm going to go over this mission of the Upward Mobility Initiative and the history of our framework. After I do so, we're going to have a very brief interactive exercise for you all today. So please come ready to engage with us in about 10 minutes or so. Then my colleague Alexis is going to provide an overview of the Upward Mobility Framework and the mobility metrics data tables. Then Isabella is going to talk about ways that the framework has been used in communities and localities, and also provide some guidance regarding available resources and forthcoming trainings. Then we'll pause for a couple of reflection questions throughout, and we'll leave about 10 minutes or so for questions and answers at the end. And before that time, we kindly ask folks to stay on mute throughout the presentation, but we will open it up for folks to come off mute during the reflections, and we welcome you to drop any questions that you have that come up in the chat, and we'll make sure to address those as we go along. Finally, just to note that today's presentation will be recorded and shared out afterwards. By way of an icebreaker, we encourage you to share your name, organization, and location in the chat. We'd love to know and share with one another who all is in the room with us today. So before we go into our overview of the Upward Mobility Framework, I want to start with the mission of this initiative. What are we working to accomplish? Mobility from poverty has too often been viewed only as a matter of individual ability and hard work, but people experiencing poverty face a web of obstacles that often undermine their best efforts. Racial prejudice, discrimination, and segregation have created especially high barriers to upward mobility for people of color. And public policies and institutional practices have created and sustained profound racial inequities and injustice. We know that communities across the country want to help residents achieve economic success, exit poverty, and live in a more equitable society. Many local leaders have committed to the hard work of dismantling barriers and building systems that support upward mobility and advance racial equity, but they often lack the information they need to reach those goals and understand whether their efforts are working. The Urban Institute's Upward Mobility Initiative helps communities fill these gaps. Through our Upward Mobility Framework, we provide communities with a way to understand and measure upward mobility. We also provide local data for cities and counties across the United States, planning resources, and training and technical assistance to help communities apply the framework to their local contexts, establish priorities, mobilize action, and assess their progress. Together, these tools support the initiative's mission to help communities create or improve conditions that advance upward mobility and racial equity. And we'll dig into these more about how we're doing this in just a minute. But first, I want to start with a brief overview of the history and development of the framework. The Upward Mobility Framework builds on a previous effort by the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which was a convening of 24 leading voices representing academia, practitioners, the faith community, philanthropy, community stakeholders, and the private sector. It was convened by the Urban Institute with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the partnership asked the question, what would it take to dramatically and sustainably increase mobility from poverty? The aim of this partnership was to gather research and evidence and coalesce around a shared answer to this question, and it resulted in some notable findings. The key finding of this group was that mobility is about more than just economic success. True upward mobility requires that people have power and autonomy and a sense of being valued by their community. To move out of poverty and stay out of poverty, people also need to feel that they have power and autonomy in their lives, the ability to make choices and influence actions that affect their future, and that they are valued in their community and can contribute to it. This broader conception of mobility that again includes economic success equally with power, autonomy, dignity, and belonging is what we refer to as the three-part definition of mobility from poverty. And it's what drives our current work on the upward mobility framework today. So before moving on from the three-part definition, I want to spend a minute discussing how the structural racism impacts upward mobility. For most people experiencing poverty in the US today, opportunities to achieve greater economic success, power autonomy, and dignity are blocked by long-standing structural barriers, not by a failure of individual effort. Many of these barriers have resulted from and are perpetuated by racist beliefs, norms, policies, and practices, and have produced deep and persistent inequities. For example, the practice of redlining, denying mortgage loans to certain neighborhoods or areas deemed high risk based on the race, ethnicity, and immigration status of people living there, created stark racial disparities that persist to this day in homeownership, wealth building, and school funding, and ultimately someone's ability to achieve economic success. Barriers to homeownership can also impact someone's ability to feel that they have control over their life and make the choices they want to make. Homeownership barriers can also make it difficult for people to feel valued in their neighborhoods and connected to their neighbors, especially if their inability to buy a home leads them to move more frequently. And being priced out of the rental market can limit housing options and create residential instability and less social connectedness. Simply put, structural racism can't be ignored, and it must be acknowledged when thinking about ways to combat barriers to upward mobility. After this three-part definition was created, a lot of people came to Urban saying, this is great and it resonates with us, but what does it actually look like to put this in practice? So we began a research project to identify successful interventions that achieved all three parts of the definition for participants. We selected 6 programs with rigorous evidence of economic impact and strong intentionality in improving power and autonomy and/or belonging to study and to provide tangible examples of programs that demonstrate all three parts of the definition. A report on our website details the attributes of each of these programs that contributed to the development of the upward mobility framework. You can also find that linked in the chat below. So I want to zoom in on one of these for a moment, Educare. Educare is an early childhood care and education model that helps prepare children from families with low incomes from 6 weeks to age 5 for success in kindergarten and beyond by providing them with highly trained teachers, state-of-the-art classrooms, and other supports that strengthen the capacity of their families to build networks, set goals, and find resources. Educare is a great example of a well-researched program that addresses all parts of the definition of upward economic mobility in practice. However, we know that programs alone, no matter how effective, are unlikely to fully break down the daunting social and systemic barriers that often prevent people from achieving mobility from poverty. We also know that getting to scale is a huge challenge for many programs. This is where the upward mobility framework can be helpful for communities and their work on economic mobility. So before we dive into the framework, we want to take a few minutes to hear from you all. Thinking about a program or initiative you're involved in, take a moment to reflect on how it aligns with the three-part definition that you see on the screen here. And if it's not fully aligned, what's missing? We'll give everyone just a minute. Okay, so I want to do a couple of quick shout outs. I see folks dropping where they're coming from. And so I see folks from Spartanburg, South Carolina. Welcome. Texas, Austin, San Diego. Really great to have folks from all over the country here joining us today. So hopefully you were able to think of a couple of examples that come to mind. So are there any volunteers who want to share their reflections? Feel free to come off mute or just share in the chat if you'd like. Okay, we'll keep going forward here. If you do have any reflections that you'd like to share, can encourage you to do that in the chat. Hopefully, our discussions today can provide a helpful starting point for filling some of these gaps, or at least some new ideas on how to do so. Now, I want to transition to introduce my colleague, Alexis Weaver, who will be walking you through the development of the Upward Mobility Framework and provide a brief overview of the framework itself. Alexis provides technical assistance to local cross-sector leaders implementing community-based efforts to advance mobility from poverty through the Upward Mobility Initiative. She has extensive experience working with the nonprofit sector to increase capacity for communities to effectively address upward mobility from poverty, with a particular focus on designing and implementing trauma-responsive, person-centered participatory research with individuals with lived experience of poverty. And outside of urban, Alexis also serves on the Tucker, Georgia City Council. Alexis, over to you.
Thanks, Jesus. I'm so excited to share some background on the development of the Upward Mobility Framework and walk through the framework itself with y'all today. As Jesus mentioned, upward mobility is about more than programs. And so with the conclusion of the U.S. partnership, our project was created with the goal of supporting local communities in creating the conditions, in particular through policy, that increase upward mobility from poverty and that narrow racial and ethnic inequities for children, youth, and adults. In order for communities to become launch pads for upward mobility, local changemakers needed to be able to understand and measure all three dimensions of upward mobility in a comprehensive but concise way. So this is the Upward Mobility Framework. We developed this framework with the support of a very smart group of academics alongside hundreds of stakeholders from the nonprofit, government, business, and philanthropic sectors, among others, and then tested it in the field to see how well it worked for local changemakers. Over time, the framework has been refined through testing in partnership with the Upward Mobility Cohort of 8 cities and counties, as well as additional research and feedback from many more organizations and communities. We see this as a living framework, and it will be updated in the future as we continue to learn more from communities about what else is needed to understand and impact local upward mobility and equity conditions. I'll now go through each part in more detail. So here you can see in green each of the components of the upward mobility framework. At the top, we start with the three-part definition, then pillars with a focus on racial equity, and then we have predictors, and finally, the mobility metrics. So now we're going to break it down. The framework starts with a three-part definition that Jesus went over in detail: economic success, power and autonomy, dignity and belonging. And then the next part are these five essential pillars that communities need in order to support the upward mobility of residents. Those essential pillars overlap to some extent and reflect the diversity of policy domains that are relevant to mobility from poverty. Note that these pillars are not meant to be silos, but rather organizing mechanisms that individuals and households experience the impact of all of these pillars when they are working well or not working well. The first pillar is opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods. Neighborhoods play a central role in supporting families' stability and well-being, their access to social and economic opportunities, and their children's chances to thrive and succeed. Next is high-quality education, from preschool through post-secondary, provides a crucial avenue to economic and social mobility. Rewarding work refers to jobs and wages that constitute the primary source of income and economic security for most people in the US today. Healthy environment and access to good health care. Good and stable health helps people of all ages surmount life's challenges, excel in school and on the job, ensure their family's well-being, and fully participate in their communities. Responsive and just governance, attentive to the needs of all community members and residents who are engaged in decision-making, are hallmarks of a community that support upward mobility. Underpinning and interwoven into every one of these pillars is to ensure equitable access for all, especially for people of color and other marginalized groups who have been most denied access to upward mobility. Combating persistent racial inequities across the pillars is central to achieving upward mobility in our communities. So this emphasis on racial equity is highlighted across all elements of the framework. A few lessons that we've learned about embedding racial equity into our work. First, equity is embedded in each step. It's a process and a result. We must also think about communities who are likely to be underrepresented in or missing from some data, like undocumented Americans or people experiencing housing instability. To measure and begin addressing equity, we need to not just consider the size of current disparities, but also gain insight into the structures, histories, and relations to power to account for the source of disparities. And as part of our work, conducting root cause analysis can be a critical step, alongside disaggregating data by race where possible. Another central way to build equity into the process of local mobility work is through community-engaged methods, which center residents with lived experience of intergenerational poverty and structural racism in both setting priorities and understanding impact. So we're going to pause here for another moment to reflect. Going back to the program or initiative you thought about in the previous activity, or another one, for the next minute, think about, one, how are you centering racial equity in your work? And two, how could you take it to the next level? So let's love to have folks share reflections in the chat. And if anyone wants to come off mute to share, you're welcome to do so. How are you centering racial equity in your work or program? Fatima?
Yeah, hi. Good morning. My name is Fatima, and I'm with the City of Sacramento. And I will say that working within government, these questions are really hard because while we have a race and gender equity action plan for the city as a whole, when particularly we look at different programs and policies, it becomes harder because there's a lot of hesitation to apply a racial equity lens, be it here in California because of, Prop 209 or other challenges. Um, but how do we continue to center that Title VI of the federal government actually requires us to not discriminate based on race? And so I think we continue to struggle with these questions, but what I can share is I think it's really important to center lived experiences and to really acknowledge community members as experts, and then to really support community-led policy development in order to help perhaps advance this work.
Thank you so much for sharing. And it looks like there's a broad agreement with you in the chat, and also some additional suggestions and ideas about where you recruit from when reaching out. So thank you for sharing. So moving into the next layer of the framework, we have under each pillar a key set of predictors of mobility from poverty. These evidence-based factors are strongly associated with the likelihood that a community can create conditions to boost the economic and social mobility of its residents while narrowing racial and ethnic inequities. The predictors were chosen after a rigorous and thorough review of the academic research around factors that most strongly influence mobility from poverty. These 24 predictors cover diverse aspects of community, cover all stages of the life cycle, and can be influenced by state and local policy. You can read more about these predictors, as well as others that were considered by the working group that helped us put this together, in our evidence resource library, including the research behind them and how they connect to the dimensions of upward mobility. And although it can take decades to measure generational mobility, we know that local leaders need actionable information to help guide their decision-making in the short and medium term. And so we come to the mobility metrics, a comprehensive but concise set of 26 metrics that can be used to support communities across the country and change makers across sectors. For each predictor, we've provided at least one metric that can be used to compare and monitor a community's performance over time. For example, to understand a community's political participation, the metric here is the share of voting age population who turned out to vote in the previous presidential election. While no data source is perfect, we aim to select metrics that best balance a variety of consideration, including data validity, availability, and consistency across geographies, and wherever possible, the metrics are available disaggregated by race. So let's look at this example of how the components of the framework connect. Under the rewarding work pillar, we have the predictor, jobs that pay a living wage. A living wage is the level of earnings that equal or exceeds the cost of a family's basic needs for food, clothing, shelter, childcare, healthcare, and transportation. Living wage jobs provide opportunities for work that enable people to meet their family's financial needs, supporting both economic success and feelings of autonomy. Ratio values greater than 1 here indicate that the average job pays more than the cost of living, while values less than 1 suggest that the average job pays less than the cost of living. The mobility metrics can be a helpful starting point for understanding local conditions, but they may only provide a surface level understanding of issues and cannot illuminate underlying causes. With any given predictor, the factors that influence people's outcomes are various and multifaceted. And so pairing the mobility metrics with supplementary local data and qualitative insights from your community can help you identify the causes underlying the problems and successes you witness or diagnose. And again, the mobility metrics are based on data from nationally available sources, which makes it easy to see how a community compares to other places across the country, but limits the set of variables included and their specificity to certain local contexts. The mobility metrics are currently available for all counties and cities over 75,000 people in the US. And I'm sure you're excited to find out what the mobility metrics are for your community and perhaps peer communities. I'm going to very briefly guide you through how to access your community's mobility metrics data. But at the July 9th session, we will take a much closer look at the data tables, walking through the different tabs available in more detail. So using the link in the chat to get to the data tables on our project website, or when you visit the Upward Mobility website and click the middle tab in the header that says data, it will take you to our data landing page, which should look just like this with the header measuring upward mobility in counties and cities across the US. We have a video tutorial that you can watch that guides you through all the main features of the data tables in case you wanted to learn more ahead of our next session or review what we're discussing today. Here's where you can start the search for your community. You'll scroll down to where it says select a county or city to explore your community's mobility metrics. The first step is for you to decide which type of geography makes the most sense for your needs. You might ask yourself, what jurisdiction is the one where I have the most influence, or which policies at what level of geography most impact me and my work in my community? And with that answer in mind, select which state you're in. An additional search bar will open for you to select your community. For counties, as I mentioned, it is all counties in the United States. For cities, it is only those cities with a population of greater than 75,000. If you represent a smaller city, we recommend looking for your corresponding county for the data tables. Once you select yours, a button will show up that says View Data Tables. Click that. The data tables will appear in a new tab in your browser. This is an example of how the data table page will appear. Every community data page has a navigation tool on the left, but just scrolling down lets you access all of the mobility metrics data tables. And again, at the next session, we'll talk more through the different tabs and features of the data tables. We'll also talk through other data resources, including a preview of our new Upward Mobility dashboard that includes all of the functionality of the data tables and much more. So let's do one final speed journaling activity for this section. What are one or two ways that you are interested and think you could use the mobility metrics to advance your work in the program you've identified in the previous activities? And we're going to take a minute for you to write that down. So would anyone like to come off mute and share one of the mobility metrics interests that you identified, and again, we'd love to have folks share in the chat. Love to hear from one or two folks. Yes, and I apologize. I want to pronounce your name correctly.
Hi, it's Osha.
Osha, okay, great, thank you.
Well, first of all, I think this is a wonderful tool, so I'm very glad that it's available to us. One of the ways that I foresee myself using it is that currently I'm looking into absenteeism amongst children and students and how that relates. So when I'm looking at the housing instability indicator and it talks about the number of children who have moved, I think that's something that I could definitely weave into my analysis. So.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. It's an excellent point. And Marie.
Hi, so at the Workforce Development Council, we're really looking at disparities around access to jobs with living wages and using disaggregated data to show where the racial disparities lie, but also connecting it with the cost of living. And we use a self-sufficiency standard rather than the federal poverty level for driving our strategies around job quality. And being really intentional about population-based strategies and priorities.
Great, thank you for sharing. Yeah, there are the metrics are really helpful, and we have very detailed. Again, on July 9th, we'll go into all of the background, but there is detail for each of the metrics on sort of the availability, the source, the quality, how frequently it comes, what geographies it's available for. Sort of robust ways to use that. We also, if there isn't a metric that quite fits, really want to encourage folks to go to the evidence resource library and look at the predictors, because there are there's a lot of connections, history, research behind how those predictors were selected. And then I'm going to go to Renee for our last share.
I had to make sure I was off mute. One of my hats is that I train family self-sufficiency program staff for HUD programs. And I have already started training with the living wage and the California living wage, but training staff as to what self-sufficiency looks like, what goal you're going for, is very powerful, because how do you help people develop goals if you don't even understand what the need is?
Great, excellent highlight. Oh, I muted myself. Love the robust discussion in the chat. Please continue to keep that going. So I really appreciate everyone sharing, and we're going to turn to the final part of our workshop to talk more and understand how communities can apply this framework. And I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Isabella Solosi, Technical Assistance Manager in the Research to Action Lab. Using her background in adult learning, Isabella designs and facilitates engaging learning experiences and communities of practice that build participants' capacity to implement social policy programs. She supported the Upward Mobility cohort through peer learning events and is now exploring how to increase access to the framework by scaling technical assistance support. Over to you, Isabella.
Thanks so much, Alexis. Hi, everyone. Really appreciate and loved seeing all the examples and the programs and the work that you're doing. So thank you for sharing that in chat, and keep the questions and the thoughts coming. So as we've heard so far, the Upward Mobility Framework is robust and can be very helpful, the metrics equally. So we wanted to ensure that this is not just a concept or an ideal that lives on a shelf, but that folks like all of you can actually use it to advance your own goals, your own work. So in this next section, I'll share some concrete examples of how communities we've partnered with have used the framework, and then highlight some resources that could be helpful to you to get started. So as you can see on the map, this is a representation of the 34 diverse localities that the Urban Institute has partnered with so far around identifying strategies aimed at increasing upward mobility and racial equity. And as we continue to partner with communities across the country, including your communities, we're using our shared learning to develop new tools, new resources, and also document how the framework can help overcome challenges and increase your impact in this work. We could go to the next slide. Through our work specifically with the upward mobility cohort that you've heard Alexis mention, we recognized early on that the mobility metrics themselves are a key starting point, but that improving the conditions that support mobility and equity in communities really takes more than just data. Successful change requires coalition building with partners across sectors and policy domains. It requires deep and meaningful community engagement, the addition of local data, as you've also heard Alexis mention, and other sources of knowledge to provide a full and nuanced understanding of the conditions in a community. And last but not least, a systems change focus that engages with the root causes of inequities. So we're not looking for band-aids, but we're looking to really address at the root cause. As you've also heard, community engaged methods are an essential part of our approach. They involve residents in every stage of the planning process, from the outset by setting goals, as well as providing opportunities for feedback to make sure that we're going in the right direction. One method of community engagement is data interactives, also known as data walks. And in data walks, we use data to share as a foundation for collaboration. So in a data interactive, residents engage with a presentation of posters with information about their communities. This includes data tables, charts, and infographics. And then residents react to and discuss what they see with facilitators. These conversations about data empower residents to explore conditions in their community, identify gaps in services and programs that could be strengthened, and to push back if the data does not reflect their lived experience. And I want to highlight two of the partners from the mobility upward mobility cohort, Boone County and Summit. So Boone County, Missouri used the mobility metrics to inform a data interactive through which they shared county level data with residents to learn about their priorities for action. Through these conversations, the community identified 3 priorities: early grade literacy, fair and inclusive housing, and jobs and workforce development. To advance work in these areas, Boone then set up 3 work groups led by community member facilitators. The work groups identified key strategic actions in these areas of focus, including improving wraparound services for young children, increasing second chance leasing opportunities, and implementing upwardly mobile business practices. Summit County, Ohio, their mobility coalition used an annual pulse survey to ask about community priorities. Then they did a second survey with people experiencing hardship to get their perspectives on the proposed areas of focus. This resulted in an action plan centered on mental health and juvenile justice, seeking a holistic approach to improve outcomes for adolescents. To learn more about ways to center community voices in your work, see Urban Institute's Community Engaged and Participatory Methods Toolkit. So by the end of our engagement with the upward mobility cohort, each of the 8 participating communities published a mobility action plan, also called a MAP, setting forth a set of a set of strategic actions they'll take to boost mobility from poverty in their communities. These maps are publicly available on the Upward Mobility website if you'd like to check them out and learn more. Since the end of our official engagement, we've learned that localities have used their maps in various ways, including to make the case for increased investments of funding and resources to continue their work, to coordinate efforts across government and non-governmental cross-sector partners, and to recruit new cross-sector partners and champions that will help them advance their work. Remember Boone County we just talked about? Well, they are making fantastic progress. Some of their early wins include being awarded a $100,000 grant from the Cradle to Career Alliance to facilitate the expansion of upward mobility programs from their action plan, getting funding from both the City of Columbia and the county to conduct the first ever countywide housing study, issuing their first annual public update, and receiving significant local media attention, which has helped to catalyze interest from key stakeholders across the county. So these are just some of the ways that communities are using the framework and mobility action plans to advance their work. Currently, Urban is partnering with 26 mobility action teams, each comprised of representatives from at least one local government and one nonprofit organization as part of the Mobility Action Learning Network. Mobility action teams are divided across 4 tracks based on the goals and learning needs they have identified. And in each track, they learn concrete tools, strategies, and engage in peer learning to advance varying aspects of their work. But let's hear about some concrete ways that these communities are applying the framework. So Tulsa and Kansas City connected through the network with an interest in collaborating on tenant protections and sharing best practices. Kansas City has been a leader in championing tenant protections, including policies around right to counsel to protect tenants from evictions. When the two connected, Impact Tulsa was assessing the impact of evictions on student success and actively providing data to Tulsa City Council, showing the link between evictions and school absenteeism. And I know we've heard somebody else working on similar challenges. Collaborating with Councilor Robinson, Tulsa City's leaders have been learning from Kansas City about the positive impact and return on investment of providing tenants with legal counsel. Together, Kansas City and Tulsa are building political support and sustainable funding to position Tulsa at the forefront of eviction prevention. Both teams showcase the value of strong partnerships, effective use of data, and a cross-sector approach for upward mobility, driving positive change in housing and educational outcomes for local families. In another example, this time of an organization that came across the upward mobility framework on their own, the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative, or RMAPI for short, is a multi-sector community collaborative with a goal to improve quality of life by reducing poverty and increasing self-sufficiency. RMAPI reframed their theory of change to focus on upward mobility and embedded the principles of the framework in their unity agenda. We'll make sure to share a link to a blog post that includes key takeaways from other local leaders about how they are applying the framework, as well as a link to an event recording where you can hear RMAPI's president speak about the initiative. For our last example, I want to share with you how the mobility metrics can be used for goal setting. Fresno Drive is a 10-year investment of the Central Valley Community Foundation with the goal of developing an inclusive, vibrant, and sustainable economy for residents in the greater Fresno region. Their portfolio focuses on topics including economic development, human capital, neighborhood development, and agriculture. The foundation and Fresno Drive showed early interest in our framework, and they now use the mobility metrics to track population level change in the region. But critically, the mobility metrics are only one type of measure they focus on. They also track a range of program level outcomes for their major initiatives and process measures to assess how well their partners are working together and embodying their values. This comprehensive approach to measurement gives a more holistic picture of conditions and systems and of the success of Fresno Drive. So I hope some of these examples have been helpful to you. And before we open it up for questions, I also want to highlight some tools and resources that can help you and your team get started using the framework. These resources will also be included in the follow-up. And I see some shout outs in chat, which is great. So the first resource, informed by our work with the Upward Mobility cohort, the urban team released a planning guide intended to assist municipalities and their partners in boosting mobility from poverty in their communities. The guide offers a beginning point for people wondering where to start and outlines a comprehensive planning process that involves building a cross-sector team, gathering and analyzing data, conducting community and stakeholder engagement, and identifying needed systems change to boost mobility from poverty and advance equity in communities. So ready to jump in? A good first step is to complete the Upward Mobility Program assessment. This series of questions will help you determine how your work currently aligns with the elements and principles of the framework and where there are opportunities to shift for more impact. You can find this assessment on page 38 of the planning guide that Katie just linked in chat. If you are interested in learning more about this process, I also encourage you to register for our July 30th session on local action, where we'll be walking through several of the strategies illustrated in the guide. I also want to encourage you to visit the Upward Mobility website if you haven't already. In addition to all the different resources that we already discussed, the planning guide, the exemplars, the mobility action plans, I also want to highlight the blog where we uplift successes, lessons learned, and promising strategies from our and our partners' work. For example, back in February, we released how policymakers can use measures of mobility from poverty affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which looks at the impact the pandemic has had on upward mobility and how we can still use that data in our work today. I also encourage you to subscribe to the newsletter so you can stay up to date with new releases, including the data dashboards that Alexis mentioned and refreshed website with lots of additional tools and resources. And the link to subscribe is now in chat. Thank you, Katie. Last but not least, we're offering 2 additional workshops, a deep dive into the mobility metrics on July 9th, and the local action workshop that you've heard about several times on July 30th. One final set of resources we wanted to share. Urban, along with Results for America and Opportunity Insights, is partnering with several membership networks representing local leaders. In addition to Urban's Upward Mobility Framework, you might want to take a look at the Opportunity Atlas, which allows you to explore where and for whom opportunity has been missing to inform solutions and help more children rise out of poverty. And the Economic Mobility Catalog, which identifies evidence-based strategies to improve upward mobility for residents. All of these tools can be used together to identify barriers and find solutions to advancing mobility and equity in cities and counties across the country. All right, so all of the resources and upcoming sessions will be included in our follow-up email to the address that you used to register. So be on the lookout for that. And with that, I'm going to open it up for some questions. I think one that I saw was how often the data tables will be refreshed, and they will be refreshed annually. A question for you, Alexis, from early on. Some people in our state believe that equity doesn't drive equality, and instead it creates discrimination among ethnic groups. How do you address that?
Yeah, and so, looking at the map, we are working with communities all across the country who have different perspectives on that, and that is not necessarily a unique perspective. One thing that we would say as an evidence-based organization is to go to the data, right? So being able to have the metrics disaggregated by race in certain places alongside things like our root cause analysis, et cetera, is one way, to engage in that conversation about how people are experiencing these disparities on the ground. And there is a lot of opportunity, I think, as we discussed kind of in that section on racial equity, that there are approaches to take that bring in the diversity of perspectives and begin to understand how people of different races and ethnicities are impacted, with not necessarily having to be explicit up front if there are places where that is fraught. And so having an approach that understands who and where people are being impacted and where there are opportunities for upward mobility, bringing them to the table through different community engagement is a really great way to kind of begin to start that conversation and bridge that conversation. And we know that, it's not just race and ethnicity. There are other ways that people are marginalized, people with disabilities, et cetera. So again, looking at the data and then being able to go have those conversations with people who are affected, I think is a great way to start to change that narrative and that conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Alexis. And if others have thoughts in chat, this is definitely a challenge that we've heard a lot of communities sharing. Please drop them in.
So I also saw a couple of questions about the Mobility Action Learning Network as opposed to the Boosting Upward Mobility cohort. As Isabella mentioned, this is, and we talked a little bit about the history, we are developing and learning and trying to make sure that this is actionable for communities. And so we had the Upward Mobility cohort and then the Mobility Action Learning Network. It was an open application process where communities who sort of were already working in some way together on upward mobility, economic mobility in their community, saw an opportunity to accelerate and advance the work. So had that application process available and ended up selecting a good number of folks to participate in this 12-month pro bono technical assistance effort, so that we can continue to learn more about the tools and how they are applied in the community. Definitely encourage folks, if you saw one of your communities that is nearby or that you're a part of on that list, to reach out to them. Isabella also mentioned that government was required to be a partner. So we have both government and non-governmental partners on each of the teams participating. And so there had to be a community-wide commitment to participating in this network as a part of this learning process.
Thank you, Alexis. I know there was one question around what should you do if you feel like the mobility metrics listed are inaccurate. Please contact us and we'll share an email address at the end of the presentation where you can do so, and then we'll have a conversation.
Yeah, and I, just to add on to that, we briefly went over that on the metrics, but again, we'll dive even deeper on July 9th. Because these metrics are nationally available, there are going to be ones that when you start digging in deeper doesn't quite fit what you understand about your community, or there may be even a data point that and a metric that works better locally. So we really emphasize the use of local data alongside the metrics, and as well, again, going back up to the predictor level to kind of look at the purpose of what we are trying to measure to show how those conditions affect upward mobility.
Thank you, Alexis. Great, we have a couple of more minutes. So if we've missed any questions in chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand and come off mute to ask a question, please do so now. Also, Katie has added a link to our event survey in chat. Please take a moment and complete the survey when you can today. Your feedback is really helpful and important to us, and it will help inform refinements and changes to this session moving forward. But yeah, any final questions from anyone?
I think there was a couple of questions about updating and if certain territories were not included. So again, we mentioned this and we are working on this new dashboard. And so we are continuing to revise and look at and find ways to get, more accessible information to people. So just want to highlight that as well.
Thank you, Alexis. Great to hear that, Wendell. Looking forward to seeing you as well at future sessions. And we know that this is, just the beginning. It's an overview. So as you dive deeper into the resources, the website, all the materials, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And we hope to see you at our upcoming mobility metrics and local action workshops coming soon. All right. Well, that concludes our workshop for today. Thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to see you soon.